How many of you know what our official color for the Moms March is? How many of you know why? Okay, well, I'm going to tell you the reason why, and then I'll tell you what I found out about it. The reason why is because I felt inspired to do this event. I know it was from God because everything in my head said turn and run. This is the most craziest thing you've ever thought of, and I didn't think of it. But I knew that it was something that I needed to do. And as I've met so many of you and worked with these amazing ladies around the country, there's no doubt that this is what I was supposed to do. That HomeMakers America was supposed to do this, and that all the incredible women and organizations, and I mean, Omaha Liberty Ladies jumped in right away, Nebraska Family Alliance, and then organizations all over the country, and even had people around the world who contacted us and said, thank goodness that you're doing this, because we're having the same problems in our country, and if America falls, what are we going to do? When I sat down and I was writing down everything that was coming to my mind and heart about this, the color lavender came. I was like, oh, you gotta have a color, right? You gotta have t-shirts, right? Then I looked up what lavender means. Lavender is a color that represents refinement, grace, love, devotion, and purity. It is a shade of purple, which is the color of royalty, and we're all daughters of God. And it is red, white, and blue blended together. It is the color that represents the best in us and that unites us. It is the perfect color. I couldn't have picked it better myself, and I have to tell you that since picking the color, I've been buying a lot of lavender. I'm not sure I look good in it, but it's working. So we can't have a Remember the Ladies banquet without remembering some of our ladies. And one of the things that I want to be able to do is bring our history and our heritage back. That is something that has been near and dear to my heart ever since I was touched by the stories that I have found that have been lost, almost stolen from our books, from our stories, from our culture. And we need to know what these stories are. Now, a lot of you have heard of women like Abigail Adams and Martha Washington, both great women. But there are a lot of other women that you may not have heard of. First, I just want to tell you something about Abigail Adams that maybe you haven't heard of, because unlike what has been promoted in our school textbooks, which I have read myself, that she was not the first feminist. Abigail Adams was a woman who loved her family. She was a homemaker. She was an amazing woman because she loved to write. She was very fluent at writing. She taught herself how to speak French. She read many books on poetry, on political science, and all kinds of things, and she guided her husband in an awful lot of ways in leading that country. So whether or not she had the vote, she certainly was moving the nation with his. And one of the things her son said of her, John Quincy Adams, was, "My mother was the daughter of a Christian clergyman, and therefore bred in the faith of deliberate detestation of war. Yet in that same spring and summer of 1775, she taught me to repeat daily after the Lord's Prayer, and before rising from bed, the Ode of Collins on the Patriot Warriors." She frequently opened her home to the Patriot, the Colonial Army, and the Minutemen. And at one time, her son said that he saw her running pewter spoons into bullets in the kitchen. And he said, "Is it any wonder that a boy of 7 years of age who witnessed this scene should be a patriot?" Martha Washington, she didn't really like a lot of high-sounding words. She wanted people who were real and who were defined. And she said of the people, of the women of the time, "Whilst our husbands and brothers are examples of patriotism, we must be patterns of industry." That's just a little bit about these two ladies. And I'm going to tell you some of the ones that you haven't heard of. We're going to save that one because that's my favorite one. Okay, Lydia Dara. Lydia Dara is one of my favorite founding mothers. She is a mother who lived in 1775 in Vermont. I'm sorry, this is the wrong one. Lydia Dara is Hannah Handy. I was thinking of Hannah Handy. I always get them confused. Lydia Darrow was a homemaker who lived in a home where the British soldiers were staying. And at one night, the soldier who was staying in her home came and said, someone's coming tonight, the general's coming tonight. I want to make sure that everybody is in bed and that you allow him to come in quietly, close the door behind you, and then go to bed, and I want it to be quiet because we're meeting. Well, of course, she does everything he said, and then she took off her shoes and tiptoed up by the door where they were meeting because that sounded awfully suspicious. And what she heard was a plot to overtake George Washington's army. And they were going to secretly come in and just wipe out the whole entire army at White Marsh. Well, she decided that that was not going to happen. And so the next day, she asked permission from the soldier who was staying in her house if she could go through the British lines to the mill to mill some grain. And so he gave her permission to do that. And she walked 25 miles carrying her sack of grain and the 25 miles back. But she also went a little bit further beyond the grain mill to meet with someone from General Washington's army to let him know what was going on. 2 days later, when the army went to White Marsh to surprise George Washington's army, he was gone. And he called to the woman and he said, "Was everyone in bed that night?" And she said, "Yes, just like you said." And he's shaking his head, just didn't believe something, she must have done something. And she just smiled and went back to her room. Hannah Hendy was a mother, 1780 Vermont. The British and the Indians worked together during that time to take America. And when the Indian raids started to come in to towns, what they would do is they would pillage the town and they would take the children and a lot of times the women, and they would become part of their tribe, and they would use them they would either make them braves or they would make them slaves. Well, her village was being attacked. There was a neighboring village that was being attacked, and they were warned. And as they were warned, her husband said, "I'm going to go and warn the neighboring town. Go to the neighbor's house and stay there." As she was going to the neighbor's house, a raid of Indians literally came in and snatched her 7-year-old son right out of her hands. And she was holding her baby, and she couldn't run fast enough to catch them. Now, this woman didn't sit down and cry and was distraught and said, "What am I going to do? Who's going to save me?" She pulled up her skirts and she grabbed that baby and she walked for miles, following the trail of these Indians, until she finally found the British encampment where they stayed. She went right up to the commander who was in charge of the encampment, and she said, "I want my son back." And he said, "Oh, we can't do that. You know, that's how we pay them for, helping us fight the war." And she said, "No, I want my son back." And he said, they're not going to hurt them. They're not going to kill them or anything. They're going to take them to Canada, and then they'll convert them into their tribe. And she said, there's no boy that can make that trip and survive. Has the British Army become that kind of army where you will kill young boys? So he relented and he gave her her son. But then she turned to him and said, "I want all the boys." And after pushing and standing up, he gave them to her. And so Hannah Hendy pulled up her skirts with all those little boys wrapped around her and her little baby in her arms, and she walked all the way back to the town where she was able to deliver those boys back to their families, who were very grateful to have them back. I don't know if you've heard of Penelope Eddington or the Edenton Tea Party. Penelope Barker, or the Edenton Tea Party. Penelope Barker lived in North Carolina, and it was during the time of the tea tax, and she took that very seriously when they said, we're done with this, we're not going to support British goods. And it was just after the Boston Tea Party. And so she decided that she was going to invite several of her friends into her home. She had 51 women who came into her home, and she said, we need to sign a document committing that we are not going to support British goods. And so they called it the Edenton Tea Party. That was the un-tea party. And at the time, tea was the in thing. And so they had no tea at their party, and they signed, every one of those 51 women signed the document that they would not support British goods. Now here's the interesting thing. Two things. One is that she said, we're not gonna cower behind Indian masks and clothes like the men did. We're gonna come right out, sign it on the document, and tell them exactly how we feel. And this document went all the way to Europe. And the English media was all over it. And they're like, so is there a female Congress in America too? And, and she's like, you know what? We don't need a female Congress because we're the women who are moving the world. And we're the women who are the purchasers. And when we stop buying, what does that mean? Well, the Edmonton Tea Party rocked the whole entire British colony. And they were struggling to be able to keep making money because the women weren't buying. This is the power of the purse. When we listen to the stories of all of these women and what they do, we have this power today. We have the power of our purse. What we watch, what we listen to, what we buy, what we support, we have the power to do that. We can stand up and protect our children like Hannah Hendy did, lift up our skirts and start walking and moving and making sure that our children are safe, that we can teach them the principles and values that we care about to make them the strong citizens that we need them to be in this country. There's two more stories I want to tell you because there have been a lot of stories told about our founding ladies and about how they were downtrodden and put upon and the men ruled everything. Well, let me just tell you, that is so far from the truth. Elizabeth Ensley Lewis is the wife of Francis Lewis, who was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. Not only did the signers have prices on their head, but they went after their whole entire families. And so they went after his family, and the commander was given the command that he was to seize his wife and destroy their property. There were British ships in the harbor, and while the soldiers came to seize the woman and seize their property, the British ships fired on her house, and a cannonball landed right beside her. And her servant was like, "Mistress, mistress, run!" And she said, "Well, it's not going to hit the same place twice." So they went in and they ransacked her home, and they took her away, and they put her in a cold prison in New York, where they barely gave her enough food to survive. She had no bedding. She was often without clothing. And when the colonial army found out about this and they threatened retaliation, they finally released her. Because of the circumstances that she found herself in, she passed away. And her husband, Francis, lived without her for 24 more years. He never remarried, but he lived to know the high and lonely price of an American patriot. Our founding fathers were good men, and I'm tired of them being vilified. Sarah Franklin Bach was a mother of amazing industry. She was the hostess for Benjamin Franklin when his wife passed away, and she always did the political hostessing. Well, she found out that George Washington's army were in dire straits. They needed basic necessities, clothes, shoes. And so she went to George Washington and said, we want to raise money, what can we do to help? And he said, well, what our men really need is shirts. And so she gathered up a whole bunch of women. They went around, they raised the money to buy the fabric. She turned her home into a cutting house, and they made 2,200 shirts for the colonial army. Now, what I find amazing about this story is that at the time, the bank, the congressional bank was broke. And Congress didn't know what to do. They threw their hands up in the air. And the women rolled up their sleeve and said, well, let's make 2,200 shirts. And so they did. And the colonial army got what they needed just in the time when they needed it most. One more amazing woman, Sarah Clark. Sarah was the wife of Abraham Clark, from the New Jersey delegation, and also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. As I said, all the signers of the Declaration were threatened and hunted, but the British were really hurtful. Sarah and Abraham paid an especially cruel price for their commitment to freedom. The British captured 2 of their sons who were serving under Washington, their 25-year-old son Thomas and their young teenage son Isaac. The sons were put in a prison ship in the harbor, and they were given very little food, and they were told, in fact, that they would be given no food until he publicly recanted the Declaration of Independence. Abraham gladly offered his life, his freedom, and all his possessions, but they were not accepted. The British demanded that he recant his allegiance and support for independence, or his sons would slowly starve. Abraham and Sarah determined that they could give up their lives and their fortune, but they simply could not give away their sacred honor, even to save the lives of their sons. Abraham never signed the recantation, and I can just envision Sarah Clark sitting in complete despair, utterly torn over the circumstances that lay before her, and Abraham by her side, equally distraught. We just have no idea what sacrifices these people made for our freedoms today. But I promise you that the women were always there, right in the front, standing beside their husbands, protecting their children, the barrier between those who would destroy and those who would give us freedom. And the women in the colonial times wanted freedom, just like we want freedom today and for our children. That is what this event is about. The Moms March for America is an opportunity for us to come together and stand for those principles and values we care about, and to have a voice where we can echo across this nation and say, we want our children to be safe. We want the right to be able to teach, nurture our own children, because we already have that right. It is a divine right given to us by God, and it is also our responsibility. But you will not take that right away from us, because you cannot. We want to honor the majority of women, the silent majority of women in this country, who stand for truth, love God, reverence family, and cherish freedom. That is what the Moms March is about. It is not a one-day event, it is a movement.